The split from Trump indicates that Flynn is moving to cooperate with Mueller. Lawyers for Michael T. Flynn, President Trump's former national security advisor, notified the president's legal team in recent days that they could no longer discuss the special counsel's investigation, according to 4 people involved in the case, an indication that Mr. Flynn is cooperating with prosecutors or negotiating a deal. Mr. Flynn's lawyers had been sharing information with Mr. Trump's lawyers about the investigation by the special counsel, Robert S. Mueller III, who is examining whether anyone around Mr. Trump was involved in Russian efforts to undermine Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. That agreement has been terminated, the 4 people said. Defense lawyers frequently share information during investigations, but they must stop when doing so would pose a conflict of interest. It is unethical for lawyers to work together when one client is cooperating with prosecutors and another is still under investigation. The notification alone does not prove that Mr. Flynn is cooperating with Mr. Mueller. Some lawyers withdraw from information sharing arrangements as soon as they begin negotiating with prosecutors, and such negotiations sometimes fall apart. Still, the notification led Mr. Trump's lawyers to believe that Mr. Flynn, who, along with his son, is seen as having significant criminal exposure, has, at the least, begun discussions with Mr. Mueller about cooperating. Continue reading the main story-related coverage. How Michael Flynn may have run afoul of the law. May 25, 2017. Mueller seeks White House documents on Flynn. August 4, 2017. How Michael Flynn's disdain for limits led to a legal quagmire. June 18, 2017. Trump unworried about what former aides will tell Mueller. Lawyer says October 28, 2017. Lawyers for Mr. Flynn and Mr. Trump declined to comment. The 4 people briefed on the matter spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss it publicly. The deal with Mr. Flynn would give Mr. Mueller a behind-the-scenes look at the Trump campaign and the early tumultuous weeks of the administration. Mr. Flynn was an early and important advisor to Mr. Trump, an architect of Mr. Trump's populist America First platform and an advocate of closer ties with Russia. His ties to Russia predated the campaign. He sat with President Vladimir V. Putin at a 2015 event in Moscow, and he was a point person on the transition team for dealing with Russia. The White House had been bracing for charges against Mr. Flynn in recent weeks, particularly after charges were filed against 3 other former Trump associates, Paul Manafort, his campaign chairman, Rick Gates, the campaign aide, and George Papadopoulos, the foreign policy advisor. But none of those men match Mr. Flynn in stature, or in his significance to Mr. Trump. The retired 3-star general, Mr. Flynn was an early supporter of Mr. Trump's and a valued surrogate for a candidate who had no foreign policy experience. Mr. Trump named him National Security Advisor, he said, to help restore America's leadership position in the world. Among the interactions that Mr. Mueller is investigating is a private meeting that Mr. Flynn had with the Russian ambassador and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, during the presidential transition. In the past year, it has been revealed that people with ties to Russia repeatedly sought to meet with Trump campaign officials, sometimes dangling the promise of compromising information on Mrs. Clinton. Mr. Flynn is regarded as loyal to Mr. Trump, but he has in recent weeks expressed serious concerns to friends that prosecutors will bring charges against his son, Michael Flynn Jr., who served as his father's chief of staff and was a part of several financial deals involving the elder. Mr. Flynn that Mr. Mueller is scrutinizing. The White House has said that neither Mr. Flynn nor other former aides have incriminating information to provide about Mr. Trump. He likes General Flynn personally, but understands that they have their own path with the special counsel, a White House lawyer, Tykov, said in an interview last month with the New York Times. I think he would be sad for them, as a friend and a former colleague, if the process results in punishment or indictments. But to the extent that that happens, that's beyond his control. Mr. Flynn was supposed to have been the cornerstone of Mr. Trump's national security team. Instead, he was forced out after a month in office over his conversations with the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak. Mr. Flynn's handling of those conversations fueled suspicion that people around Mr. Trump had concealed their dealings with Russians, worsening a controversy that has hung over the president's first year in office. 4 days after Mr. Trump was sworn in, the FBI interviewed Mr. Flynn at the White House about his calls with the ambassador. American intelligence and law enforcement agencies became so concerned about Mr. Flynn's conversations and false statements about them to Vice President Mike Pence that the acting Attorney General, Sally Q. Yates, warned the White House that Mr. Flynn might be compromised. The conversations with the Russian ambassador that led to Mr. Flynn's undoing took place during the presidential transition. When questions about them surfaced, Mr. Flynn told Mr. Pence that they had exchanged only holiday greetings. The conversations happened in late December, around the time that the Obama administration was announcing sanctions against Russia. While Mr. Pence and White House press officers repeated the holiday greetings claimed publicly, Mr. Flynn and the ambassador had in fact discussed the sanctions that invited the idea that the incoming administration was trying to undermine the departing president and curry favor with Moscow. Mr. Trump sought Mr. Flynn's resignation only after news broke that Mr. Flynn had been interviewed by FBI agents and that Ms. Yates had warned the White House that his false statements could make him vulnerable to Russian blackmail. Since then, Mr. Flynn's legal problems have grown. It was revealed that he failed to list payments from Russia-linked entities on financial disclosure forms. He did not mention a pay speech he gave in Moscow, as well as other payments from companies linked to Russia. The former FBI director, James B. Comey, has testified before Congress that Mr. Trump asked him to end the government's investigation into Mr. Flynn in a one-on-one meeting in the Oval Office the day after Mr. Flynn was fired. Mr. Trump's request caused great concern for Mr. Comey, who immediately wrote a memo about his meeting with the president. And investigators working for Mr. Mueller have questioned witnesses about whether Mr. Flynn was secretly paid by the Turkish government during the presidential campaign. Mr. Flynn belatedly disclosed, after leaving the White House, that the Turkish government had paid him more than $500,000. Mr. Flynn's firing was, in some ways, the first domino that set off a cascade of problems for Mr. Trump. After the president ousted Mr. Comey, news surfaced that the president had requested an end to the Flynn inquiry, a revelation that led to Mr. Mueller's appointment. That, in turn, raised the profile of an investigation that the president had tried mightily to contain.